Number 10. A lot of fans may argue that Jon Jones may not be a big draw. However, his grudge match against Daniel Cormier at UFC 182 sold 800,000 pay-per-view buys. His fight against Quinton Rampage Jackson and Chael Sonnen has sold over 500,000 pay-per-view buys. Number 9. Chael Sonnen was one of the best trash talkers in UFC history. He had the ability to create interest surrounding his fights. His first fight with Anderson Silva at UFC 117 sold 600,000 pay-per-view buys. His rematch with Anderson Silva sold 925,000 pay-per-view buys. Number 8. Nick Diaz is one of the most popular fighters in the UFC and always brings a lot of attention when he fights. His fight against Anderson Silva at UFC 183 sold 650,000 pay-per-view buys. His fight against Georges St Pierre sold 950,000 pay-per-view buys. Number 7. Chuck Liddell was one of the biggest stars in the UFC in the early days. His stand and brawl fighting style made him a must-see fighter in the UFC and was definitely a big draw in the promotion. His trilogy fight with Tito Ortiz at UFC 66 sold more than 1 million pay-per-view buys. His fights with Renato Sobral, Rich Franklin and Quinton Rampage Jackson have sold over 500,000 pay-per-view buys. He was definitely a huge star who brought in a lot of attention to the UFC. Number 6. Georges St Pierre is one of the biggest pay-per-view draws to come out of Canada. Although he hasn't sold more than 1 million pay-per-view buys, his fight against Nick Diaz sold 950,000 pay-per-view buys, and his rematch with BJ Penn sold 920,000 pay-per-view buys. With GSP talking about his return, he will definitely do a big number in the pay-per-view sales. Number 5. Anderson Silva is one of the biggest pay-per-view draws to come out of Brazil. He has brought in 600,000 pay-per-view buys 6 times in his UFC career. His rematch with Chris Weidman at UFC 168 sold over 1 million pay-per-view buys. His rematch with Chael Sonnen at UFC 148 sold 920,000 pay-per-view buys. His fight with Vitor Belfort sold 720,000 pay-per-view buys. He was definitely a big part of the UFC's growth. Number 4. The former UFC Women's Bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey is one of the biggest draws in the UFC at the moment. Her quick finishes have fans tune in whenever she fights, and she has sold extremely well on pay-per-view. Her last fight against Holly Holm at UFC 193 sold 1.1 million pay-per-view buys, and her fight against Bethe Correia sold approximately 900,000 pay-per-view buys. She is definitely one of the biggest drawing powers in the UFC today. Number 3. Before Conor McGregor burst into the UFC, Brock Lesnar was the biggest draw at that time. His second fight with Frank Mir at UFC 100 had the highest buy rate of all time, which was 1.6 million pay-per-view buys. Brock Lesnar has sold more than 1 million pay-per-view buys 3 times in his UFC career, with his fights against Shane Carwin, Cain Velasquez and Randy Couture. His popularity is still evident as he recently returned at UFC 200. The event sold 1.2 million pay-per-view buys. Number 2. After Nate Diaz defeated Conor McGregor at UFC 196, Nate Diaz became a massive superstar. Both Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor built up interest surrounding the event during interviews and press conferences. UFC 196 sold 1.6 million pay-per-view buys, matching UFC 100. A rematch was scheduled for UFC 202, where Conor McGregor won the fight by a unanimous decision. This event broke all-time pay-per-view records, which sold 1.65 million pay-per-view buys. Number 1. The UFC featherweight champion Conor McGregor is without a doubt the biggest pay-per-view draw in UFC history. Many may say that he talked his way to a title shot and was given an easy path to success, but his ability to draw people in to watch his fights is truly amazing. His last fight against Nate Diaz at UFC 202 was the biggest pay-per-view of all time. This event sold 1.65 million pay-per-view buys, which exceeded his previous fight at UFC 196, which sold 1.6 million buys. Conor McGregor is definitely a big part of the UFC's growth today.